Thank you. You know, it's funny, I always tease about Pastor Jessica being the bad cop, but as you can tell, the ladies' retreat starts on Thursday, and she's still not willing to say, if you haven't signed up, you're not coming. That's how much she loves you. So ladies, just so you know, also you can always tell a person who doesn't do the yard work when the list gets to 2 tools and runs out. So I'm excited for that work day. Hey, I'm going to invite Patrick Banworth to come up. If you guys don't know Patrick Banworth, he is on our board here at Foundation Church. He's actually currently serving in kids ministry today, so who knows what your kids are doing while he's up here for these few minutes. But we've as a board decided that we want to just have some different conversations around like what's happening at Foundation Church and how we can promote what we're doing and what that looks like. And so today we're actually talking through the topic of generosity. And so I've invited Patrick to come up and just share from a board perspective what that looks like. Will you welcome Patrick with me?
Thank you, Rick. Hey. I tried this conversation on the kids before I came up here, and it was met pretty poorly, so hopefully it's better received here. Again, Patrick Banworth, if I haven't hit, and I think I've met just about everybody here, at least here that's this morning. But if I haven't, my wife Katie and I have been coming to Foundation Church since 2017, and we've had the great pleasure of seeing the church grow and shift and change and take, significant leaps of faith. And what I'm here to talk to you today a little bit is about finances. We're not going through pro formas today, but we will just kind of highlight a little bit about what's been happening as a look back to last year and then what we're thinking about as we look forward into 2026. And that's really kind of the focus as a board. As we were going through this whole process, we wanted to stay focused on what the church's mission is, and everybody should know that because I know we've talked about it ad nauseum, which is helping people know Jesus through deep work and community over time. And so that was the starting point when we began this conversation. If we go back to last year, we took a significant leap of faith, none more significant than the shift to Emmanuel Presbyterian, and as with any transition, there's additional costs that come with that. But it supported the greater ministry impact, daily use of space beyond just our Sunday gathering, and it just naturally aligned with their mission. So I think the board at large thinks it's been a really, really positive shift. Again, naturally creates some one-time costs, but I want to start by thanking both Rick and Pastor Jessica for the efforts of making sure that we're back on track from a budget standpoint. Everything's ship-shape there. Beyond that, I also want to thank this congregation at large for your generosity and your ability to step up. We obviously get a lot of demands, a lot of requests for resources, not just some demands, but also requests for your time and your talents. And in every instance, this congregation has stepped forward and stepped up to deliver and to help that out. And it makes our decision-making process really, really easy when everybody's so generous. And so, again, thank you for that. Looking forward into 2026, so the board said, well, what can we do to improve transparency and to ensure that everybody kind of knows what we're doing? Because a lot of things get filtered to the board, and then sometimes it's not always well known amongst everybody that's part of Foundation Church. And so in an effort to improve that transparency, we decided that we were going to do these quarterly communications that talks about what we're doing at Foundation Church with everybody's generosity and with the resources that we've been provided. And as part of that communication, you'll see stories of how individuals have been impacted, highlights of spiritual growth, encouragement and resources around practicing giving too. Some of you that are part of small groups might recall how we've done the practice of giving through the Practicing the Way, I think, right? Through our small groups. And so that's been a really helpful resource for our group, and I think just something that we'll continue to highlight. So again, quarterly communication around that. And again, it's all based on a stewardship mindset. It's not about institutional expansion. The focus is on cultivating biblical stewardship, not accumulation. So that's really what this whole communication effort is behind right now. So Really excited for that. Thank you, everybody, again, for your continued faith in what we're doing. And if you have any more questions about how we're utilizing our resources, please feel free to stop me, ask. Totally an open book. We're excited to share as much as you want to know anyway, right? I know that everybody doesn't necessarily want to go into the X's and O's, but totally happy to do that. So just know that we're available and as a resource. So thanks for your time. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll let you get back to those kids, and hopefully everything is still fine down there. So I'm just kidding. His wife's down there as well. And we all know she's the responsible one of the two. So will you stand with me as we read God's word together? We are going to be in Matthew chapter 6 as our text for today, starting in verse 19. This is what it says. It says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks. You can have a seat. I want to tell you a parable. One day, there was a wealthy man preparing to go on an extended trip. And so, in effort to prepare for that, he called his servants together and he delegated responsibilities to care for the property. To one, he gave $5,000. To another, he gave $2,000. And the third one, he gave $1,000. And he did that based off of their responsibilities and their abilities to oversee the property. And then he left. Right away, the first servant went to work and actually doubled the master's investment. The second did the same. But the man who got a single $1,000 actually took the money and hid the money in a safe place. After a long absence, the master of those three servants of the property came back and began to settle up with each of his servants. The one given $5,000 showed him how he had doubled his investment, and the master commended him. "Good work. You did your job well. From now on, I would like to invite you to be my partner in this endeavor." The servant with the $2,000 showed him how he had also doubled his master's investment. His master commended him. "Good work. You did your job well. From now on, I want you to be a partner with me in this endeavor." The servant given $1,000 said, "Master, I know you have really high standards, that you demand the best and make no allowances for error. Therefore, I was afraid that I might disappoint you, and so I found a good hiding place and secured your money. Here it is, safe and sound down to the last cent." The master was furious. He said, "That's a terrible way to live. It's criminal to live cautiously like that. If you knew I was after the best, why did you do less than the best? Why did you go after the least? The least you could have done would have been to invest the sum of money with bankers, where I could have at least gotten a little bit of interest." Then he said, "Take the 1,000 and give it to the one who risked the most. And get rid of this play it safe who won't go out on a limb. Throw him out into utter darkness." Now, as you may have picked up in this parable, this is actually an embellished retelling of a parable that Jesus used titled Bags of Gold, or the parable of the talents. And in this parable, the wealthy master is trusting his servants to be in charge of his estate as he prepares for an extended time away. And then in order for things to go well while he is gone, he delegates these responsibilities to each servant and gives them the money and the resources and everything they need in order to care for the estate well. Now, each of his servants have different responsibilities. They have different abilities, and so they're all given different amounts to invest. But in the end, no matter how much they were given, no matter how much they were entrusted to steward, each of them was expected to use everything they had in order to play big. And the one that upsets the master, the only one of the three that upsets the master in this parable, is the servant who actually played it cautiously and hid the resources until his master's return. And in that parable, we see that the reason that he hid it ultimately was because he was operating out of fear. Now, we are nearing the end of a series that we have titled Formed, a series designed to refresh us as a church on our communal rule of life, which is centered around 10 practices that through Jesus' teachings and through his ministry and through his rhythms we observe, and we effort to make those a reality in our own life. Now, as we look at each of these practices, something that we need to remember is that while these practices are very meaningful, they are still a means to a greater end, okay? They are ways of practicing the rhythms and teachings of Jesus so that we can be formed into the likeness of Jesus. In other words, as Dallas Willard said it, we do what we can do to create the space for God to do what we cannot do. Jesus talks about this same idea, but he does it in the language of vine and branch in John 15. Verse 5, he says this, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So the practices then act like a trellis. They are not the point, but they are the growth supporting mechanism that help the branches grow and remain attached to the vine. And so today we are going to talk about the practice of generosity, which can include being generous with your time and generous with your abilities. But for our time today, we are going to focus on being generous with money, because a large portion of Jesus' teachings that we read in the Gospels are actually dedicated to that very subject. How we are called to be generous with our wealth, with our money. So here's what our communal rule of life, which you can find on our bookmark. If you don't already have one, grab one, take it with you, read it. But here's what it states about the practice of generosity. This is the community that we are trying to become. It says we are becoming a community of contentment in a culture of consumerism through the practice of generosity. And so what we see is that generosity becomes both an act of remembering and embracing Jesus' teaching about being content and how to live with a content purpose and a content mindset in this world, and it is the primary way that we actually combat or fight against that magnetic force and pull of consumerism that surrounds us, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes. But before we get into the passage that we read just a few minutes ago, I did want to take some time, as I've done with each one of these practices, and just highlight how engaging these practices will affect your mind and your body, both psychologically and physiologically, because there are some really great benefits on practicing these practices for the whole body, not just because you are meant to do it, but because it actually changes the way that your body responds. It's almost like God knew we needed these practices, right? And so here, let's look at, for just a moment, how practicing generosity affects the body. First of all, it reduces the negative responses that we feel in our body. Being generous is actually shown to reduce the stress hormone cortisol. It lowers blood pressure, and it can actually improve overall body recovery from strenuous situations. On the flip side, practicing generosity doesn't just diminish negative, but it can actually increase positive responses in your body. Practicing generosity has been connected with increased levels of dopamine, which is the body's reward and motivation system, increased serotonin, which is the body's mood regulation system, and increased oxytocin, which increases social bonding and trust building. Very interesting, right? And finally, studies have shown that people who practice regularly, who practice generosity with regularity, have improved immune function, and they are known to generally live longer. Now, that's all information from various medical articles and resources that I've kind of combined, but I find it to be very interesting that it's not just about the benefit of giving it away for those who get it, but there's an actual response as human, as embodied people that we receive, that we get to actually enjoy as we practice the gift of generosity. Now, we know that these benefits are not the reason why we are called to practice generosity. They are definitely benefits to be considered, but they are not the main point. But I will say this, just like me, and probably just like you, a less stressed out and more healthy version of me is better for everyone else around me. So even if that were to be all that I get out of practicing generosity, which it won't be, it's still a good thing. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to the passage that we read at the beginning in Matthew. Matthew 6, and I'm going to read just verses 19 through 21 at this point. It says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So once again, we find ourselves in a passage from the Sermon on the Mount, which is a collection of Jesus's core teachings, okay? So this teaching is not some obscure idea that we've dug out of the depths of Scripture in a book that you don't even know how to pronounce the name from. It is actually a core teaching of Jesus. And because of that, we know that the impact of what Jesus is saying is going to impact us on an everyday type of basis. In this teaching, Jesus is specifically addressing the idea of our treasures. Now, I know that many of you, as do I, treasure lots of things. But in this case, Jesus is specifically talking about money, about wealth. And so that's the context that Jesus is using. Something important that we should notice is the language that's being used here. Jesus is not warning us away from having wealth. That's not what Jesus is saying in this passage. Jesus is saying that we are not meant to store that wealth up for ourselves. In other words, Jesus wants his audience to think of themselves as stewards and not as owners, which makes us like the servants and not the master from our opening parable. So if we can read ourselves into the parable at the beginning, we are more like the servants, not the master. Therefore, what we have is ours to manage. It's ours to steward. It's ours to use for the benefit of God's kingdom. So is having money bad? No, not at all. It's not at all bad. Is saving money bad? No. As long as we're not storing it up for ourselves. That's Jesus' primary condition in this section. Do not store up treasures on earth for yourselves. He says to store up treasures in heaven for yourselves. In the Old Testament, each community had this particular place that they would call the storehouse. You may have seen that language in the Old Testament as you've read it. And the storehouse is actually this place where people pooled together their extra resources so that in times of famine or this great need of any type, they could actually tap into it and they would distribute those resources to the people who had the greatest need. Then in the New Testament, the same language is translated as treasury. So we see it shift from storehouse to treasury, where every useful resource would actually be kept safe and ready to use for those who are needed. So people would use what they needed out of their stuff, whether it would be like grains or cattle, whatever they had, they would use it to support their own family, and then they would pool the extra together so that they could support the whole community. These concepts are often hard for us, though, to grasp because we live and just operate in such an individualistic culture. But that does not mean that we can excuse ourselves from seeing ourselves as stewards, as Jesus is prescribing in this passage, rather than owners. We can understand from Jesus' teaching that God gives each person what they need. And then the extra becomes this tool to care for and bless those who have needs around us. And so Jesus completes this first section with a very important aspect of managing our wealth. First, stored up things are subject to thieves and moths, which is language for theft and destruction. And so Jesus is saying, hey, when you do store up stuff for yourself beyond what you need, you're actually exposing it to being destroyed or being stolen. Whereas if it's in the storehouse where it's guarded and pooled together, then it becomes this thing that can be protected by the entire community. And so Jesus is challenging us in this way. Instead of becoming excellent hoarders of our treasure, which I am a phenomenal hoarder of all kinds of weird things. You just ask my wife. She's over it in some ways. So we're not meant to become excellent hoarders of our treasure. We are called to be great stewards of the resources that God has given us so that we can build up treasures in heaven where they cannot be destroyed. And then he finishes with this: because where your treasure is stored, there your heart will be as well. I love the commentator David Guzik's just kind of interpretation of this. This is what he says in his commentary. He says, Jesus drew the conclusion that you can only have your treasure, in parentheses, your heart, in one place. We cannot store up treasure on earth and in heaven at the same time. But Jesus' teaching doesn't just stop there. That's a very wise and pertinent teaching on treasure. But he doesn't stop there. He actually continues on. This is what it says in Matthew 6:22 and 23. He says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Okay. Seems like a bit of a mystery, right? Jesus is like practical, like don't store up your treasures on earth where it can be stolen and destroyed, but in heaven. And now he's talking about light and our eyes. Okay, so what is Jesus getting at? Well, if this section was on its own, you could probably read a lot of things into this passage, and people certainly do. But this passage is not on its own. It's actually directly connected to the idea of generosity. So let's unpack what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is highlighting that the eye is the gateway to the entire body for light, which allows us to see the world around us as it is. Contrast that with darkness. When there is darkness, we cannot see the world around us as it is. And so we respond differently depending on if we are in a dark space or in a light place. Can you agree with me on that? Yeah, a few head nods. We're almost asleep. This is perfect. Okay. He's trying to highlight that there's two different ways. If it's light, you will respond one way. You will see the world and respond. And if it's dark, you will not see the world, and so we respond differently. Well, what happens when things around us are dark? We move more slowly. We move more cautiously, as if at any moment darkness is concealing an enemy who could attack us, hurt us. But when things are light, we see the world for what it is, and so we move freely and lightly. And even if danger is present, we can see it well enough that we can either defend ourselves or hopefully just avoid it altogether. And so Jesus is using this perspective of light and dark, the eye, and how light gets into us to shape a perspective on money. And this perspective on money that Jesus is giving us is defined by two mindsets. There is the darkness perspective where we operate cautiously and slowly and protective. And this protective mindset actually influences us to begin to see the world with a scarcity mindset. If this is our mindset, if this is your mindset, you will make moves very cautiously, holding your treasure close to your chest, constantly afraid that in any moment danger could be lurking, or at least that you would make a poor decision with that and it would result in not having enough. But Jesus contrasts that with a view of light, or a perspective of light. And this perspective that is full of light creates an abundance mindset. This mindset is built on trusting that you will always have enough because you see the abundant world that God has created all around you. Yes, you plan well, but your plans involve generosity, and they do so out of abundance. You see, the funny thing about perspective, if you really reflect on it, is perspective does not change reality, right? Each of us have our own perspective on the same reality. The reality is that we are all living in a world that God created and that God sustains. That's our reality. And the reality is that we have everything we need to accomplish everything that God establishes for each of us to do. You know how I know that? It says so in 2 Corinthians 9. Let me read it to you. Verse 10 says, "Now he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness." Okay, but we're not farmers. This is an agrarian analogy, but we're not farmers. We're trying to connect. Well, thankfully, it continues on. Verse 11 says, "You will be enriched," and this is as clear as it can be. "You will be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through your generosity, and through us, rather, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God." I love that line. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. God will enrich us. God will give us all that we need specifically to each and every one of us so that we can be generous on every occasion, and that the generosity that we practice would yield people giving thanks to God. You see, this is the type of promise from Scripture that acts like an assurance. This is the type of promise that I want to hold God to. Because as I begin to practice generosity, as I begin to build this assurance in God's faithfulness, in His promises, it expands my ability to live into that same gift, that same practice. Jesus, in this teaching that we have from Him, is helping His audience understand that our perspective on this world is very important. It will dramatically impact your ability to be generous, which is why the capstone thought of this teaching is so compelling. Verse 24, the last verse of this section says, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." No, Jesus, don't say that. Like you shouldn't, or it's probably not going to work out well unless you're great at investing. That I can live with. But that's not what Jesus is saying. You cannot serve both God and money. Jesus says we cannot have competing allegiances, and in particular, that we cannot be aligned with God and with money. In this particular verse, Jesus brings up a very important reality because it seems like on the surface that God is this person, the Trinity, alive, active creator, and money is just a tool. But if money was just a tool, why would Jesus even bring up this need to align ourselves with one or the other and to really drive home the point that we cannot serve both? Well, in the Greek, the word that is used for money here is actually the idea of mammon. And in many translations of Scripture, you actually see that specific Greek word left there because it is so distinct and so important to many of the translators that we understand that it's mammon, which is money, but it's actually much more than money. Let me explain. I've actually found the work done by author and cultural commentator Andy Crouch to be very helpful in defining and describing like what mammon is and how it influences us in our modern day. In this book that he wrote called The Life We Are Looking For, this is how Andy defines mammon. He says, mammon is not simply money, but the anti-God impetus that finds its power in money. He goes on to say this about mammon. For mammon wants something very much indeed, because mammon is ultimately not at all just a thing, nor even a system, but a will at work in history. And what it wants above all is to separate power from relationship, abundance from dependence, and being from personhood. What mammon wants is a world of context-free, responsibility-free, dependence-free power measured out in fungible, storable units of value. Ultimately, what mammon wants is to turn a world made for and stewarded by persons into a world made of and reduced to things. Thus, the reason for Jesus' stark statement about God and mammon becomes clear. We cannot serve the true God and mammon, ultimately, because their aims are precisely opposed to each other. Not just kind of, precisely opposed to each other. God wishes to put all things into the service of persons and ultimately bring forth the flourishing of creation through the flourishing of persons. Mammon wants to put all persons into the service of things and ultimately to bring about the exploitation of all creation. Now, it's obvious, but I'll say it. Andy is not Jesus, okay? And Jesus' words are ultimate on this matter. They are the ultimate authority. But the reason that I wanted to bring Andy's comments into this space is to highlight that mammon represents so much more than currency. Mammon represents so much more than currency, especially to Jesus' original audience. You see, we live in a world that wants to understand everything through this like empirical experiential lens that disregards the spiritual nature that is all around us all of the time. Spiritual forces that are at work both for us and against us. The spiritual nature of God working on our behalf and the anti-God impetus that we see in mammon. So for Jesus to say that we cannot serve both God and mammon is not a commitment, or rather a command to rid yourself of your money, but rather it is to run away as far as you can from worshiping money, from depending on money, from living in service to money and the things that money gets us. You see, if we fail to see this reality that Jesus is getting at, then we have a hard time avoiding falling into mammon's trap, which is to be pulled apart, to have dual allegiances to God and to mammon. Jesus then has given us this masterpiece of a teaching on the subject of money, and he did so in such a wonderful way. So let's recap it really quick to see what Jesus says, and then let's talk practically about how we live it out. First, Jesus opens up with a very practical teaching. Don't build up your treasure on earth, but build up your treasure in heaven. Encouraging us to carry a very healthy perspective on money, using the light analogy to show us that God is an abundant provider. And then he finishes with this crescendo that you cannot be aligned, allegiance, worship, serve both God and money at the same time. It will be one or the other. In this one teaching, Jesus, the brilliant teacher that he is, he shapes our hearts and our minds and our hands. See, with the hands, it represents that we are meant to be good stewards with what we have been entrusted with, just like the servants from the opening parable. And then he addresses the mind to have the proper perspective on God as provider and the abundant world, all of the examples around us about the birds having what they need and the flowers having what they need. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about that. It says, do not be worried. Look around you. See how I have provided need for all of these beautiful things around you. So he shapes our mind. And then he shapes our heart, which is represented by our allegiance to God, trusting in God, faithfulness to God. Now, if you're reading this carefully, as I have many times this week, it might actually be easy to think that Jesus kind of has the order of things a little backward, right? He starts with the practical, and then he moves to perspective, and then ultimately to like the heart being aligned with God. And I don't know about you, but I just feel like that what I actually need is for God to give me a generous heart so then I can have the right perspective. That way I can live out a generous life. But that's not what Jesus does, unfortunately. Jesus actually does it the opposite. He says to start by living in a trusting way and acting out an act of generosity, as simple as that can be in your world. It does not matter. Just act it out. And then watch how God uses that faithfulness to begin to shape your perspective, to hold tightly to his promises, to his truths. And out of that, we begin to see a heart of generosity, a heart aligned with God, beginning to take shape in each of our lives. I just wish it was the other way around. I wish I didn't want to hold on to those resources sometimes. But God doesn't say, first get the right heart, then change your perspective, and then it's okay to be generous. But it's actually the other way around. That is how God shifts our perspective. That is how God begins to grow you into a person of generosity. So let's get really practical for a moment then, because that's how Jesus leads. If the practice of generosity is not something that you are very familiar with, here's your homework assignment, okay? Ask God to show you a person in your life to be generous to, and then just do one simple act of generosity to them. Buy them a coffee, buy them lunch, Send them an unexpected gift. Whatever it may be, just be generous to that person, okay? I wanted so badly to make a joke there about generosity, about how your homework assignment is to give us all your money, but I didn't do it. But I obviously couldn't hold it in, so I still had to get it out there. But that's not the point. That's not what we're getting at. I'm going to address that in just a second. What I want us to see is how small acts of generosity begin to build a habit. They begin to exercise a muscle in us that needs to be developed by working it over and over again. You cannot be a generous person just in thought. It takes being generous with your actual treasure to somebody you love or somebody you don't even know. It doesn't really matter, but to begin to do that thing so that God can begin to show you the reality of his love and abundant provision in your life. So your homework assignment is to be generous. And if you already have the practice of generosity as a regular practice in your life, I want to encourage you to try expanding it. Buy 2 people coffee or take 2 people to lunch, and to do it anonymously. Just a few paragraphs earlier in Matthew 6, this is what it says. It says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their the reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I'm not even sure how to do that, but that's what Jesus said, okay? So that your giving may be done in secret. Maybe put your left hand behind your back. I don't know. But the point is, the Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Okay, so we talk about generosity at church, and ultimately, I don't think this about any of you, but somebody will watch this online and be like, this guy's about ready to ask for money, isn't he? He's about ready to ask for our resources. And I chuckle because I know this isn't true. This church is so generous. But anybody who has that mindset, I just want to say I'm sorry that is your mindset. For whatever you have experienced that has created that perspective in you. Whatever it is, I'm sorry that you have experienced that. And I personally would rather you practice generosity far outside the walls of Foundation Church than miss out on what Jesus is saying in this passage. So if that's your thought ever, please take your generosity to another church for that matter. I don't mean leave. I mean, we'll send them the check for you. Like, whatever that means. I don't mean leave. Don't hear me say, definitely stay here. We'll learn this together. I just mean, this is not a plea. See what happens when I get away from my notes? Please stay. We'll send your money somewhere else, is what I mean, okay? Pastor Rick told us to leave. Okay. That'll be a great testimony to your friends. But for real, if that's something that you've held, I've talked with the board at length about this. I've talked with the staff about this. We are not going to be a church that manipulates people into the things that we think we need. This is not it at all. Jesus is saying, be generous. And if you choose to be generous in and through Foundation Church, praise God. This church exists as all other churches do on people's generosity. But do not let your fear or your angst or even your anger around this topic stop you from practicing the generosity that God is inviting you to. We'll figure out a way to make that meaningful for you outside of these walls, but do not miss the opportunity. And here is the thing that I want us to just kind of encapsulate this all with from 2 Corinthians 9. This is what it says. It says, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And verse 8 is so wonderful. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all you need, you will abound in every good work. Isn't that incredible? And it's true. I've seen it in my own life, and I've seen it in the lives of so many people in this church alone. So I just want to take a moment and quietly reflect on, where is God calling you to be generous? Is there a person in your life who could really use the encouragement of just receiving an unexpected gift? A coffee, lunch, or maybe it's something greater than that. Maybe God's been kind of tugging at your heart to bless a family or to pick an organization and just give not only your time to, but your resources, your treasure to. This church is full of generous people. It's incredible to me. So I have no doubt that as we are reflective on these matters, that God will continue to not only call us to be generous, but to provide us, as Scripture says, with everything we need to do everything He's calling us to do. We start with the action. We let that shape our perspective and begin to see God build a generous heart into us. Let's take a moment as the band comes up and just quietly reflect on where God's calling us to generosity.